Welcome back to Field Notes. I'm Connie Chan, and this is a new video podcast series from Andreessen Horowitz, where we talk about the business models and behaviors changing in consumer technology. This is part 2 of my conversation with Deb Liu. Deb is a former VP of Commerce at Meta and the current CEO of Ancestry. We talk about how marketplaces should determine their take rates, why density is the key to winning a local market, and how we can use what she calls unintentional, ridiculous strategies to get your next promotion. If you missed part 1, be sure to check out our last episode for a deep dive into marketplace metrics. Talk about your book, Take Back Your Power, which I think is a fantastic book, especially for people working in tech. And you give lots of tips on how to communicate, how to present yourself, how to find mentors. Tell me about, I guess, what are the common things that you find that people really need to learn to better communicate?
I think the biggest thing is there's a chapter I call Not Giving Yourself a Free Pass. And it's really about something my friend Carol Izazaki teaches in her class, which is this unintentional ridiculous strategies, is what she calls it. And this unintentional ridiculous strategy is how many times do you go into a meeting and before you walk in, you're like, I'm not going to say anything at this meeting, or I'm going to sit in the back and just listen, or I'm going to barely show up and be distracted. But how many times do you walk out of a meeting having done just that? And so she's like, if you
Mhm.
show up, really show up. Like, decide before you walk into a meeting what you want to do and what you want to say and what you want to land, and then do it and then leave. There's no hanger ons. And so, that really changed the way I looked at kind of really showing up every single day to every meeting. It's like either be present or don't go. And I think sometimes we have this kind of, well, just observe and absorb. And that's just, we're
Yeah.
not in school. That's not how the workplace works. And so,
Why
really
is that
kind
a
of,
dangerous track to take?
well, if you go to a meeting and people see you in 5 or 6 meetings, you didn't say anything, they're like, what does she do all day? I just see this. There's a huge bias. And I wrote this article called The Hidden Bias No One Talks About. And I think the book Quiet talks about this too by Susan Cain, which is people who are extremely quiet. There's just a huge bias against not showing up, not talking. I've seen
Yeah.
calibrations in meetings where we're talking about promotion and like, we should promote her. She gave a great presentation. And I'm like, the presentation was 5% of the work. The rest of, she's like a good PM, but maybe not a great. And then they're like, this other person, I'm like, we should promote this person. She's great. And then like, no, she doesn't present very well. And I'm like, but 95% of her, she has shipped twice as much as anybody else. But you see how in the calibration committee, it's all the people who only see you in the bigger rooms. And so if you're not showing up, the people who are deciding whether you get promoted, how your ratings are, they're there's what they see is the 5%, and they're judging you 95% on that, and your manager is spending
Right.
all their time fighting for you for the rest of the time. And so what I really encourage people to do is like help your manager. Just if you're going to show up, really show up, do your very best in the places where other people see you, because that's how they judge you. And by the way, whether it's fair or unfair, I think it's completely unfair, but at the same time, that's the reality we live in.
So I love the conversation we had about marketplaces last time. I want to continue going through marketplaces because you've worked at so many yourself and have built some of them from the ground up. Take rates. How do you think about take rates? And I ask this because when we look at marketplaces, not every marketplace is the same. Some charge take rates of 20 plus percent. Some charge zero take rate, and then they try to add it in later. What are your thoughts on how a marketplace should think about how to price its take rate in a marketplace?
Well, first, I think you need to think about take rates in actually three different sections. The first one is listing fees. Listing fees keep inventory for marketplaces. So often that's not something which a lot of sites do. But at the same time, listing fees also prevents and reduces the number of spam postings as well. And so you're kind of balancing two things. And so they use
Yeah.
it as a filter. And I think listing fees does that. And so that's one part of it, which is what is the role of listing fees in your service? And a lot of services just want maximum inventory and they will actually focus on quality through different other mechanisms. But that's one piece. The second piece is really the take rate, the transactional kind of consumption or kind of consummation rate. And that's where a lot of
Right.
people make their money. And some you've seen up to 50% or 70%, depending on, if you're looking at, for example, I think the Real, they do authentication. And so they charge something like upwards of 50% if you're only selling one bag of something like that. And so you really need to think about the second piece is on the transaction rate, what are you trying to incentivize? And in some markets there's tons of margin, right? If you're selling a bag or maybe something out of your closet, you have
Yeah.
much more flexibility because you don't have a hard cost of goods. You bought this a long time ago. The other option is donation, and so therefore maybe 20, 30, even 40% would make sense. But at the same time, you're really competing at other marketplaces on, are you driving sufficient value and liquidity? The third bucket is really thinking about marketplaces where it's not a single transaction, it's a long-term relationship. So things like Upwork or Fiverr, where you're actually hiring somebody. Same thing as like tutoring marketplaces, these types of things where you're buying something, but you're not buying it one time, you're actually buying a relationship. And so when
Yeah.
you're buying these kind of teaching relationships, it is so easy for somebody to just get your phone number and take it off platform and have a long
Right.
relationship. And so they're using the marketplace as lead gen. And it's very hard, especially for in markets like that where it's very easy to take off platform. Then maybe you want to charge a lot up front and a little later. Because if you're charging, say, 20% all along the way, at some point I would just rather, for example, pay the service provider directly if I want a long-term relationship where I'm paying them a few hundred or $1,000 a month. Why would I want to pay $200 to a marketplace when I could just pay $100 more to the service provider? So really thinking about where you're playing it there, and do you want to actually have a graduated schedule where you charge a lot, maybe 80%, upfront, and then maybe 5% kind of just processing later to keep them on the platform. But if you get that out of whack, what you're doing
Yeah.
is you're doing a lot of introduction upfront for long-term relationships, but not capturing sufficient value upfront.
And when you think about schedule, how do you think about schedule also vis-a-vis like how big of a seller you are? Would you have different take rates for the, first dollar amount and then a different take rate for the dollar amount after that and after that to kind of incent more business?
Well, I think part of it is how much, is your marketplace really small sellers versus very large sellers? A lot of marketplaces have the 80-20 rule, right? A small 20% of the sellers do 80% of the sales. But then it's
Right.
easier for somebody else to attract that 20% if they're able to offer something different. And so what are you doing that's really keeping them? Is it the brand that you're offering? Are you offering some incentive? What Amazon does is they offer the buy box, right? And once you earn into the buy box, you don't want to leave. And so you're incented to drive more sales to that channel.
I talk about how a lot of e-commerce of the future will actually come from social networks because
Mm,
ads and commerce are actually very symbiotic
yeah.
and naturally should go together. It's only for some strange reason in the US we kept it very separate for a long time. And only now are we starting to combine the two, I think.
Well, if you actually think about it in the Target circular and the Walmart circular, a lot of those are actually co-marketing deals done with the manufacturers themselves. They are themselves ads for ads, right? The
Yeah.
end cap of every shopping center, like you go to the supermarket, right? The end cap, there's a pay to play to be part of the end cap. It's part of a larger deal, either through discounts or rebates. Shelf space is the same way in a grocery store. You
Not
think
sure
a
if
grocery
average
store is
people even think about that. Like, I'm not
yeah,
when you walk into a store, you don't realize, yeah, someone Oreo is paying for that spot,
yeah,
right?
absolutely. And most people don't know this. I actually spent some time consulting in this industry many, many years ago, and I was shocked. To get on the eye line shelf, there's like a shelf space system that is totally different, and you think it's
That's different
organic,
price than the bottom
correct?
shelf.
And so you
Right.
access buying that shelf space, and it's called slotting fees. It's such an important part of the grocery business because grocery
Yeah.
margins are actually very, very low.
So much of the time I think about what is the future of e-commerce? Just look at physical commerce and replicate more of it.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, grocery stores are a marketplace, right? It is a group of people wanting to sell something and a group of people who are buyers who are looking for something, and grocery stores are
Yeah.
arbitrating that and what they show. And yet we don't think about it that way, right? We see them as retailers, and in some ways they are, but they are also the arbiters of who shows up, what is sufficient quality in what,
Yeah.
what gets space and how is it ranked in the ecosystem.
Okay, I also want to talk about defensibility of a marketplace because on one
Mm.
hand, they have great moats, fantastic network effects. Like Craigslist looks like a very old website, and yet it still gets tons of traffic. I still would post a listing on it if I needed to rent out a place, right? But how does Craigslist or other marketplaces defend against these new up and coming marketplaces?
Well, I think the challenge Craigslist had is they didn't really make the jump to mobile. And one of the big challenges is their site just wasn't suited for mobile, and it was really hard to browse and search on their
Yeah.
service. And so that made it an opportunity for disruption. If you and they also were not category oriented. So I don't know if you've seen the slide where it has like Craigslist and how all these companies were just picking off
Yeah.
pieces of
Jeff
Craigslist.
Jordan talks about this all the
Yes,
time. You
yes.
take apart Craigslist and each one is a massive company.
Absolutely. And so you look Airbnb, like they contacted people on Craigslist and said, "Hey, would you like to list?" They would actually reach out to people and rent places and then, ask them to join. And so, it's an opportunity to really think about what it is that it made you special, which on Craigslist was there just wasn't online classifieds and they were able to really tackle that. And local was very difficult because on desktop you had to identify I am in X place, the San Francisco
Yeah.
Bay Area. Where do you live? How far are you willing to go to get X? And so it was very, very hard. But on mobile, we have everyone's location. And you can actually tell within a very small distance where something is, and you can search for things within distance. And they just haven't been able to make that jump. That said, it's still a really vibrant site, and I still use it as well. Even though I obviously built Facebook Marketplace, but occasionally I'll browse there just to see what's there. And there's still some really interesting inventory.
Okay, so let's dive into Facebook Marketplace. Some marketplaces, you need geographic density and you have to really own a city before you move on to the next city. And then there's other marketplaces where, like, I'm just throwing it into the mail and it's getting shipped by USPS and it doesn't matter what city you live in. What are the different types of advice or things that you'll tell founders to think about if they're building local versus purely online?
Well, local is all about density. Density, density, density. And people really kind of open too many markets at the same time. But if you can get product market
Yeah,
fit in one city and then the next one and the next one. And I think Uber did a really good thing, which was really focus on density, but having a GM per city that they wanted to go into so that they're not
yeah.
placing bets nationally, they're placing bets locally.
I think a lot about how commerce can evolve even inside something like Facebook. There's Facebook Marketplace, but then a lot of transactions also happen on things like Facebook groups. How do you
Yes.
think about those kinds of kind of curated or oftentimes private communities that are also selling?
Well, I think it's one of those things where it depends on what you're trying to do. Like a lot of mom communities actually buy and sell with each other, and they prefer to do that not an open marketplace. If you have kids sleeping, do you want strangers walking through your house or do you want a fellow mom to buy those clothes, right? And it depends on what you're selling. Like for a car, you want maximum coverage, right? Because the probability of any individual wanting your car is actually relatively small because it has to be like the right mileage and the right budget and things
Right.
like that. So you really want liquidity, so access to buyers. But if it's something like kids clothing, you know and it's a crib, somebody wants to come to your child's room to go look at the crib, you want something where trust is much, much higher. And so really thinking about how do you balance those things, and those closed communities will continue to exist, and I think that they're an important part of commerce.
And we can also talk about payments because you have so much experience from Facebook payments here. How does Facebook Marketplace even know that you purchased it from a lead that you got from Facebook
Yeah,
Marketplace, right? Like when push comes to shove, why would they pay online versus just paying you cash or giving
yeah,
you a check in person?
yeah,
Um, but payments is such an important part of a lot of successful marketplaces in seller financing or buyer financing. I
yeah.
know a lot of younger generations use a lot of buyer financing now. Talk to me about the role that payments plays in a marketplace.
Well, so I worked at PayPal when it was acquired by eBay, and suddenly the addition of PayPal. So the number one thing that eBay did was reputation first. But the next thing they did was payments. Because trust, if you send someone a check or you send them a money order and they don't send you the product, trust was a huge issue. And it was very impossible. It was
Right.
almost impossible to adjudicate that. You say you sent a check, the person said they shipped it, didn't arrive. What happens, right? And so, with payments, now you know that the payment went through, there's a tracking number, and suddenly there's buyer protection. And so that opened up so many possibilities, and it grew eBay at a time when it was, it had growth was still good, but suddenly you could see it really take off after payments. And then the next step was shipping,
Yeah.
adding shipping labels, which was a project that I also worked on. And I think, you can see these kind of step functions. You see with Poshmark just having the flat rate shipping that they negotiated for shoes, for example, or for their goods,
Mhm.
was really hugely inventive because they worked with the USPS and everyone has access to that in the US. And so really thinking about these moments where payments plus shipping, what are the things for your
Yeah.
marketplace that are the kind of like the hockey stick, right? And those things, payments is one of them because you are both adding trust, but you're adding guarantees around, service provision, and you're adding something where you, the marketplace, has complete visibility.
When you talk about payments, like in the beginning when eBay was that almost like an escrow like service, right? when you think about what the role that they were playing. Versus when you look at marketplaces and payments today, oftentimes like you pay right at purchase, and then the seller may or may not actually ship the thing to you. And then you have to complain on both sides to actually settle the money or to figure out if the transaction was legit or not. How would you redesign that if you were to, or do you think this is the right user flow?
Well, one thing that the US has never done is true escrow. In a lot of other countries, like in China, for example, they really do
Right.
escrow where you have to accept the item to basically release the funds. In essence, in the US, the difference is that we have credit cards and chargebacks, right? The equivalent is you can always charge back. So there is a backstop, it's a different backstop than in a country like China where you're basically paying cash, but you're releasing it on the other end. So we don't have true
Right.
escrow. And so if you think about it, I think for you, it's really understanding like when is the transaction truly consummated where both parties are satisfied.
Are there other delightful user experiences that you think have really been game changing for a marketplace?
Well, on the live video side, QVC has been around for a long time, and yet it never has taken off in the US for live video until Whatnot and a couple of these kind of, these
Yeah.
live marketplaces. But there's a lot, I think, that could be really, really delightful from a user experience perspective. For example, when you were shopping for handmade goods, it was really hard to find, right? And now it's like a whole category. They have to decide how
Yeah.
much they're going to balance kind of the real handmade like custom stuff. So the stuff I often buy from there are custom made. So has my kids' names painted on it or something like handmade for somebody versus something that's mass produced, right? Because that's not what you're going there for a different
Yeah.
reason. And so, but it made it a delightful experience to see artisans really put their product out there. And so there are some of these experiences that are really unique and have been able to capture that. I think StockX did that with shoes. You've seen that, with Goat. Like they really kind of speak to the nature of somebody who loves sneakers, which, when
Yeah.
you would say, well, how big of a category is that? But the same thing, like shopping someone else's closet. Like, is that something that you really spent a lot of time thinking about doing? But it wasn't like there wasn't. I bought a ton of clothes on eBay, by the way, many years ago, right? Early on, and yet it's like a much more personalized kind of engaging feed. And so, as opposed to a search-based feed, it's like a they gamified kind of resharing
Yeah.
and liking. And
It's
so they
knowing
make
your customer and what would appeal to them most.
yes. And I think that's the thing is each of them these marketplaces appeal to that specific category. But it's very hard to replicate that in other categories. And so, you could probably go to home goods and
Mhm.
in Poshmark, but could you really go to like books? Like unlikely because it's a much more standard product. And so, really thinking about the extension of where you go and really the what is it that you bring to the table?
Thanks for watching Field Notes, my new video podcast series featuring leaders in consumer tech. Be sure to subscribe to the A16Z channel so you don't miss an episode.